History likes to keep its scandals tidy, but tonight we're going to knock over one of its neatly stacked boxes, because the official record insists Henry VIII had one illegitimate child. That is a lie. There was another, a girl who shouldn't exist, whose life threatened the delicate web of Tudor politics simply by breathing. Her name was Ethelreda Malte, though she would collect more aliases than most spies. Her mother? A palace laundress who handled the king's most intimate garments. Her official father? The royal tailor, which is convenient, because someone had to stitch together a believable story. And yet, this tailor's bastard was raised like a hidden princess, wrapped in silk and privilege she had no business having. And the evidence? Buried land grants, suspicious documents, and whispered testimonies that the crown hoped you'd never read. Why would a tailor suddenly own more land than half the nobility? Why would a nobody child glide through court like she belonged there? Stories like this vanish when no one supports the people who dig them up. So subscribe if you believe erased women deserve to be remembered. And before we begin, what time is it where you're drifting off to this? A quiet past is about to unravel. If you want to understand why a secret daughter like Ethelreda Malte was unthinkable, you first have to slip quietly into England in the late 1520s, a kingdom that spent most of its waking hours biting its nails. Not literally, of course, because Tudor hygiene wasn't quite up to that level of casual hand-to-mouth contact. But you get the idea. England was anxious. Very anxious. The kind of anxiety that keeps entire nations up at night. At the centre of all this tension sat King Henry VIII, a man who believed he had been personally handcrafted by God for greatness, but who was also realising that greatness comes with a few more complications when you don't have a legitimate son. And in the 1520s, Henry's lack of a male heir wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a national crisis wrapped neatly in royal frustration and topped with the memory of decades of civil war. To Henry, England wasn't simply a kingdom. It was a delicate family heirloom passed down through bloody hands, and he was terrified of dropping it. The root of the panic traces back to Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife. Catherine was a remarkable woman, dignified, intelligent, politically shrewd. But her pregnancies told a heartbreaking story. She endured miscarriage after miscarriage, stillbirth after stillbirth, interrupted only by the birth of one surviving child, a daughter, the future Mary I. Now Mary was intelligent, resilient, and destined to become queen. But in the 1520s that was beside the point. Henry wasn't looking for resilience. He was looking for a boy he could parade around Europe as living proof that the Tudor dynasty was secure. A boy who could inherit the throne without the entire nation collapsing into another civil war. A boy who would keep the crown firmly on the Tudor family tree, not shaken loose by ambitious relatives. And the fear of civil war wasn't paranoia, it was collective memory. Only a few decades earlier, England had been torn apart by the Wars of the Roses, a grim family dispute that left the royal family tree looking like someone had taken pruning shears and just gone wild. Nobles switched sides faster than modern sports fans. Armies marched, kingdoms toppled, and the crown bounced between branches of the Plantagenet family like a very expensive, very dangerous game of hot potato. Henry VII, Henry VIII's father, had won the final round of that chaos. He united warring houses, married Elizabeth of York, and stabilised England. But the wounds weren't healed so much as scabbed over, still fresh beneath the surface. Henry VIII had grown up hearing these stories whispered in corridors and taught in lessons as cautionary tales. He understood, perhaps more than anyone, that crowns without secure heirs tend to start wars faster than you can say, succession crisis. So, when Catherine of Aragon continued to lose pregnancies, Henry began to feel the pressure crack through his carefully groomed sense of destiny. Imagine the court at that time, ambassadors pacing anxiously, courtiers whispering behind tapestries, astrologers probably pretending to read the stars while silently hoping nobody asked them the hard questions. Everyone was waiting for a royal boy. Everyone expected him. Everyone needed him. And there Henry stood, young, handsome, athletic, adored, yet unable to produce the one thing the kingdom demanded of him. Now, Henry was not the sort of man who accepted failure lightly, or at all. In fact, he preferred to simply redefine what failure meant. In this case, he interpreted the repeated tragedies as a sign, a personal message from God, a divine telegram that Catherine was not the woman meant to bear his heir. This belief might seem dramatic today, but Henry didn't arrive at it alone. Advisors, interpreters of scripture, and political opportunists all had their reasons to nudge the king towards certain conclusions. After all, a king who doubts his marriage becomes a king who rearranges history and power in interesting new ways. But whether divine sign or diplomatic spin, the lack of a male heir weighed heavily on Henry's mind. It shaped nearly every major decision he made in the coming years, and, as you'll soon hear, it created the perfect conditions for secrets, truly monumental secrets, to take root in the shadows of the Tudor court. This period saw Henry staring down the terrifying possibility that he might leave England without a clear successor. And that looming threat began to twist his judgment, warp his patience, and unravel the threads holding his marriage. And soon, the entire religious foundation of his kingdom, together. The pressure didn't come from England alone. European courts were watching closely. France, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, every major power wanted to see who England's next ruler would be. Alliances depended on it. Courtships hinged on it. Entire treaties rested on the assumption that Henry would eventually present the world with a legitimate son. So, imagine the embarrassment, the political humiliation, of producing only one surviving daughter. In the gendered logic of the Tudor era, it almost didn't matter that Mary was healthy and capable. She simply wasn't what Europe expected. And Henry felt the sting of those expectations more sharply than anyone. His pride was wounded, his dynasty vulnerable, and the entire kingdom quietly wondering what would happen if he never managed to produce a male heir at all. This is the emotional climate into which Ethelreda Malte would eventually be born. But even before her conception, before her mother entered Henry's private orbit, the stage was already set for secrecy. A climate of desperation, fear, and political fragility made the idea of an illegitimate daughter, especially one born during such a turbulent period, absolutely dangerous. So, before we ever meet Ethelreda, before we trace the story of her mother or the tailor who became her official father, we must first understand the tinderbox England had become. A kingdom pacing circles around its throne, a king terrified of history repeating itself, a court straining under whispers, and an entire nation holding its breath, waiting for a son who stubbornly refused to arrive. That is the world into which a hidden daughter would eventually step, quietly, invisibly, and with far more significance than anyone dared to admit. To understand how a secret daughter could slip into the cracks of Tudor history, we must first examine one of the most entertaining, and frankly questionable, claims Henry VIII ever made. And that's saying something, because Henry made a lot of questionable claims. But this one, it deserves its own spotlight. Henry VIII insisted, with a straight face, that he remained celibate for 7 years while waiting to marry Anne Boleyn. 7 entire years. Now, if you're familiar with Henry's personality, appetites, habits, and general approach to life, this statement lands somewhere between deeply suspicious and absolutely hilarious. This was not a man famous for restraint. This was a man who struggled to restrain himself from having a second helping of roasted swan at dinner, let alone 7 years of chastity. But Henry presented this narrative with the confidence of a man who believed any claim sounded more believable if he said it loudly enough and added a few Bible verses. Let's paint the picture. It's the late 1520s. Henry is obsessed with Anne Boleyn, to the point where he's writing passionate love letters, rearranging his entire political identity and pacing the corridors like a lovesick teenager waiting for a reply. Anne, for her part, was clever enough to recognise the opportunity. She refused to sleep with him before marriage, insisting on purity not because she was naive, but because she was strategic. She understood the rules of this deadly game. Queens were made, and queens were destroyed, on the basis of purity. If she gave in too early, she'd be just another royal mistress, and mistresses, as Anne had seen firsthand through her own sister Mary, had a habit of being used and discarded without ceremony. So Anne held the line, and to her credit she held it firmly. What followed was Henry's dramatic claim that he respected her wishes so completely, so utterly, that he simply shut down his entire romantic life out of devotion. No mistresses, no flirtations, celibacy powered by pure, burning, monogamous longing. The ambassadors, diplomats, and foreign observers did not buy this for 1 second. These people had watched Henry for years. They had watched him chase women like a hunting dog chasing anything that looked vaguely edible. They had watched him fall in and out of infatuation with alarming speed. They had, frankly, seen the man eat. And anyone who's ever watched Henry VIII tear into a leg of mutton can tell you, he was not a man built for prolonged self-denial. Ambassadors at court wrote to their sovereigns with a tone of polite disbelief, the kind you use when someone insists they only had a small slice of cake, and you watched them inhale half of it. One ambassador, the Venetian Francesco Sanuto, noted that Henry was not accustomed to remain incontinent, which is diplomat speak for absolutely not, no chance, never happening. Then there's Henry's lifelong pattern to consider. This is a king who acted on desire impulsively, emotionally, and often with devastating speed. When he wanted something, a woman, a divorce, a jousting tournament, a piece of land, a particular cloak, he wanted it immediately. Patience was not his strength, and restraint, even less so. This was a man who transformed England's entire religious identity because he wanted to marry someone who wasn't his wife. So if he wasn't with Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn refused intimacy, then Henry's celibacy claim becomes at best creative. At worst, it becomes political fiction, a convenient narrative packaged for public consumption. And Henry did need a narrative. You see, during these 7 years, Henry was fighting a political battle with Rome. He wanted his marriage to Catherine annulled. He needed Europe to believe he was morally justified. If he admitted to taking mistresses during this time, it would weaken his argument that the marriage was invalid because it lacked male heirs. After all, if he'd been busy elsewhere, the problem could hardly be blamed on Catherine alone. So the claim of celibacy was not born from piety. It was born from strategy. But why not simply take a noble mistress during this time? Why not find a discreet lady of the court, someone who could be trusted? The answer is simple. Noble women were political landmines. Taking one to bed could inadvertently form alliances, inflame rivalries, or, worst of all, give foreign ambassadors leverage. Henry was already under scrutiny. Every move was being watched, every gesture interpreted, every rumour amplified. The Boleyn faction and the Aragonese faction were locked in a cold war of gossip, influence, and calculated alliances. The slightest misstep could tip the balance, so Henry avoided noble women, and he avoided anyone with enough status to cause diplomacy-related chaos. Which brings us to a crucial point. If Henry sought intimacy during this supposed 7-year gap, it would not be with a lady of rank. It would be with a woman who existed outside the glittering courtly spotlight, a woman with no political family, no factions, no ambassador whispering in her ear. Someone invisible, someone safe, someone inside the household staff, perhaps. Someone whose work granted her quiet access to the king's private spaces without attracting attention. someone whose presence would not set off alarms in the European diplomatic network. In other words, someone like a laundress. Now, we're not yet naming names, that will come later. But we must understand the logic behind it. Henry's claim of celibacy, as charmingly unrealistic as it is, reveals something important. If he was romantically involved with anyone during this period, it had to be someone who left no political trace, and household workers, the women who washed his linens, cleaned his chambers, and moved through the palace as quietly as shadows, were exactly the kind of people history routinely overlooks. This is why understanding Henry's 7-year vow of purity matters. It isn't just about whether the king could control himself, he couldn't. It's about understanding how a king boxed in by politics and ambition might seek comfort in the only direction left available to him. And it's about understanding how, in the shadows of this improbable celibacy, the conditions were perfectly set for a secret child to be conceived, a child the world was never meant to see. And if you'd like this story, and others buried just like it, to keep being told, don't forget to subscribe. Most people don't, and that's how stories like hers disappear all over again. To understand how a secret affair could unfold in the royal household without causing an immediate diplomatic meltdown, we have to step quietly, very quietly, into one of the least glamorous yet surprisingly intimate corners of Tudor palace life, the laundry rooms. Now, if you're imagining soft piles of folded linens, scented soaps, and an air of domestic tranquility, absolutely not. Tudor laundry was not a Pinterest board. It was a battlefield of boiling water, scorching steam, heavy fabrics, and stains that no one politely described but everyone urgently wanted removed. The palace laundresses were divided into a surprisingly structured hierarchy. At the very bottom were the general linen workers, the women who handled tablecloths, napkins, towels, the endless stream of household cloth that accumulated in a palace with hundreds of mouths and even more messy habits. That work alone could fill the better part of a lifetime. One rung above them were the women trusted with the bed linens. This meant sheets, blankets, and any fabric unfortunate enough to end up anywhere near a Tudor mattress. And yes, Tudor mattresses were about as cooperative as you'd expect from large sacks of straw and wool that rarely, if ever, had a day off. But at the very top of this hierarchy were the most trusted of them all, the women who handled the king's personal linen, undergarments, nightshirts, handkerchiefs, garments that no one outside the most intimate circle ever saw, and that included members of the Privy Chamber. Anyone touching these items needed to be discreet, invisible, reliable, and capable of keeping their eyes politely pointed at the floor. And here's the secret about palace laundresses. Though they occupied one of the lowest social positions, they had some of the highest access. These women entered rooms others could not. The king's bedchamber wasn't just a ceremonial space. It was part laundry drop-off zone, part dressing area, part medical station whenever Henry's health problems flared up. Laundresses walked through it all. They came and went with armfuls of cloth, steaming tubs of water, and the kind of quiet confidence that comes from being so overlooked that people forget you have a fully functioning memory. They moved through the Privy Chamber as well, a place accessible only to an elite circle, the king's closest companions, personal attendants, and, if you were carrying the right pile of linen, you. They entered the king's dressing space where he was measured, cleaned, dressed, and sometimes complaining loudly about everything from his leg ulcers to his political enemies. The beauty, or the danger, of being a laundress was this. People noticed you just enough to hand you the laundry, but not enough to record your name in the official accounts. They were neither entirely seen nor entirely supervised, both present and invisible, crucial yet dismissed. And the palace power structure thrived on that invisibility. Consider the daily rhythm of these women. They would arrive early, collecting soiled linens with the practiced efficiency of women who knew that once the washing began, the day would descend into steam, sweat, and the clatter of copper pots. They scrubbed stains under icy water or plunged cloth into cauldrons of boiling lye soap. They wrung out heavy sheets with arms stronger than any courtier's ego. They worked in the heat for hours, surrounded by the indistinguishable sense of wet cloth, wood smoke, and detergent strong enough to peel paint. They were rarely seen by courtiers. Courtiers preferred to pretend laundry happened magically, as though linen simply cleansed themselves out of respect for noble blood. The king himself barely acknowledged laundresses, except perhaps with a nod or a muttered greeting on days when he felt magnanimous. And yet, and here is the heart of it, these women knew things. They knew the king's habits because they washed evidence of them. They knew his moods because they overheard the way he spoke when he thought himself unobserved. They knew his illnesses because they laundered the garments associated with them. They knew who slept in which beds because clothing tells stories even when people don't. This was information no ambassador could obtain, no courtier would admit, and no noble woman dared whisper. That made laundresses uniquely powerful in a quiet, unacknowledged way. They lived in the castle's bloodstream, moving through corridors no one monitored closely, slipping through doors no one questioned, overhearing conversations no one filtered. Their invisibility was their protection. Their anonymity was their shield. And in the rare moments when the king paused in a chamber at the wrong time or the right time, when a laundress happened to enter just as he was dressing, resting, brooding, or looking for a distraction from the stress of politics, a conversation could begin. Not a recorded conversation, of course. Nothing dramatic. Just a few words exchanged in the margins of royal life. These women were not court beauties. They were not calculating nobles. They were ordinary, hard-working women, but that ordinary quality made them safe. No ambassador would assume anything improper. No faction would suspect hidden intentions. No court gossip would think to watch their movements. If someone were to slip past the watchful eyes of ambassadors and scheming nobles and capture a moment of the king's unguarded attention, it would be someone like this. Someone unthreatening, unnoticed, and already present in the room. And that, more than anything, explains why this class of women becomes central to our story. Not because they orchestrated grand schemes, not because they held political influence, but because the palace's obsession with hierarchy and status left them entirely unmonitored. The irony, of course, is that this very invisibility made them a perfect hiding place for royal secrets. It made their presence natural, unremarkable, and entirely unrecorded. And in a world where every noble woman's gesture was documented, debated, and sometimes weaponized, sometimes the safest place for the king's most personal entanglements was in the hands of the people history tried hardest to ignore. This was the world, hot, humid, chaotic, and strangely intimate, that existed behind the elaborate facade of the Tudor court, a world where secrets could simmer quietly, unnoticed, until the day they surfaced in the most unexpected form, the birth of a child who had spent her entire life walking the line between seen and unseen. Before we move any further into the story, we must finally bring someone into the light, a woman history did everything in its power to erase. Her name was Joan Dingley, and unlike the noble women who filled court paintings and ambassadorial reports, Joan's existence survives only in the faintest traces, the kind you'd miss if you blinked while turning the page of a dusty archive. Joan was a laundress, not the glamorous sort of role people like to romanticize today. This was not the Tudor equivalent of a spa job. This was blistered hands, aching shoulders, and more boiling water than any doctor would recommend. But Joan wasn't just any laundress. Most historians believe she worked among the handful of women entrusted with the king's personal linens, his undergarments, nightshirts, sweat-stained shirts from long days in armour, and, yes, the sheets of the royal bed. If you want to know someone intimately in the 16th century, you didn't read their diary. You washed their laundry. And Joan washed the king's. Picture her. Moving in and out of chambers few people were allowed to enter, arms piled high with fabrics that carried the physical traces of Henry's daily life. She belonged to no faction. She attended no banquets. No foreign ambassador was monitoring her. No court faction saw her as a threat. She lived in the palace, yet outside its political machinery, quiet, invisible, and trusted in a way that only someone unimportant could be. Which is precisely why she became important. By the time Joan drifted into Henry's orbit, the king was a man pushed into emotional corners. His decades-long struggle to get a male heir had turned his marriage into a battlefield. The Pope wouldn't grant him an annulment. Europe was laughing behind embroidered sleeves, and Anne Boleyn, sharp, strategic Anne, had drawn a firm moral boundary between them that the king couldn't cross. Henry was many things: impulsive, charming, self-righteous, anxious, occasionally delusional. But above all, he was a man who didn't enjoy being denied. Not by Rome, not by Catherine of Aragon, not by fate, and certainly not by his own desires. So where does a king go when every noblewoman is politically radioactive? When any flirtation could explode into scandal? When ambassadors report his every movement like medieval paparazzi? He goes where no one is looking, to someone like Joan. We cannot reconstruct their first conversation, but we can imagine the possibility. Joan entering a chamber at the wrong time or the right time. Henry frustrated after a council meeting, distracted by the storm of politics swirling around him. She would have known how to lower her eyes, how to step aside respectfully, how to vanish into the work. She had no reason to flirt, no desire to rise above her station, no ambitions to become a royal mistress. And ironically, that made her safer than anyone at court, because Joan didn't want anything from him. And that, to a king surrounded by demands, expectations, and carefully curated compliments, must have been disarming. The relationship that followed wasn't a sweeping romance in the style of Arthurian legend. It wasn't the breathless, politically supercharged affair he had with Anne Boleyn. It wasn't driven by ambition like the courtship of Jane Seymour. It was simpler, quieter. A king stepping out of the glare of politics and into the shadows of his own palace. And Joan, whether by circumstance or quiet willingness, became the person who caught that unguarded version of him. We should be honest here. This wasn't an equal relationship. The power imbalance was so vast it cast a shadow over both of them. Joan had no ability to refuse a king. Henry had every reason to keep their interactions hidden. She was vulnerable. He was isolated. Their worlds collided not through romance, but through a strange mixture of loneliness, opportunity, invisibility, and the precarious safety of someone who posed no political threat. And yet, no matter how discreet an affair may be, the palace always finds out when someone becomes pregnant. When Joan's pregnancy was discovered, the reaction inside the household administration was not joy. It was terror. Panic spread like spilled ink. This wasn't a love child born to a noble mistress whose family could be bribed or bought. This was a laundress, a woman with no political shield, no diplomatic use, and no safe place to explain her condition. If the wrong people found out, it could undermine Henry's carefully cultivated narrative, that he was a man of moral restraint during the years he sought an annulment, that he had been chaste out of devotion to Anne Boleyn, that his troubles had been purely spiritual, not physical. A pregnancy could ruin everything. So the palace moved fast. Discreet conversations behind closed doors, urgent meetings with officials Henry trusted, calculations about how to bury this situation permanently. The solution needed to be simple, effective, and permanent. Joan Dingley could not continue as she was. She could not raise the child alone. She could not appear connected to Henry. She could not be allowed to drift into gossip or desperation. And the child, that tiny problem with royal blood and dangerous potential, needed an identity, a father, a cover story so airtight it could survive the weight of history. The affair shrank into silence. Joan faded out of the palace records almost as soon as she entered Henry's life. She disappears from documentation with unnerving speed, the kind of disappearance that only happens when powerful hands are smoothing the pages of the story flat. And at the centre of it all is the undeniable truth. Joan Dingley's name only survives because her pregnancy forced the palace to create a narrative around her. She exists because she had to be erased. Henry's involvement never appears in the official paperwork, but the reactions, the panic, the hush, the sudden administrative creativity betray the truth more clearly than any confession could. This was not a grand love affair. This was not a scandal meant to shock the court. This was an intersection of power and vulnerability, hidden within the corridors of a palace trained to keep secrets buried under layers of protocol and silence. And it is from this quiet, concealed relationship that one of Tudor history's most fascinating figures would eventually emerge. But for now, Joan Dingley stands alone in the shadows, a woman whose brief, unrecorded closeness to a king reshaped the life of a child, the dynamics of a royal household, and the historical record itself. Before Ethelreda Malte ever took her first breath, before the land grants, the marriage, or the quiet whispers of royal blood, there was a man who unknowingly stepped into the centre of a secret he never asked to hold. His name was John Malte, and like Joan Dingley, he lived the kind of life history rarely bothers to document, until he suddenly became useful. Let's start with the basics. John Malte was Henry VIII's tailor, and he began serving the king around 1527. That date alone is fascinating because it places him right at the beginning of Henry's escalating marital crisis, precisely when tensions were rising, alliances were shifting, and the king's patience with the universe was wearing thin. It was a period when Henry needed absolute loyalty from the people around him, and anyone who entered his immediate orbit had to understand the subtleties of survival. Tailors in the Tudor world weren't just people who stitched seams and took measurements. They were custodians of royalty's most personal details. Imagine someone who measures you regularly, adjusts your garments, notes the changes in your body that you'd rather not admit. The weight gained, the weight lost, the swelling of an ulcer, the stiffness in a limb, the rounded shoulders after too many sleepless nights. John Malte knew Henry VIII more intimately than many courtiers ever would. If a monarch's body was a battlefield of time, illness, and stress, the tailor was the general quietly keeping track of every shift. Malte knew where Henry's shoulder sagged after a jousting injury, where his calf bulged from hours on horseback, and where clothing needed to be modified because the king's waistline and sense of moderation were no longer on speaking terms. This level of physical access created a strange sort of relationship. Not friendship, not equality, but something far more practical. Familiarity. Malte worked long hours in the king's presence. He heard conversations, complaints, outbursts, and confidences spoken within the dressing chamber. He was invisible in the way all good service staff were expected to be, yet ever present in moments when the king was most unguarded. And this made him unusually trustworthy. Not in the sense that Henry would pour out his heart to him, but in the sense that Malte had no political ambitions. None. He wasn't a nobleman jockeying for lands. He wasn't a foreign agent gathering secrets. He wasn't trying to marry off daughters or negotiate alliances. His livelihood depended entirely on royal favour. Favour he would lose instantly if he opened his mouth even half an inch too wide. In other words, Malte was the ideal kind of servant for a king whose life was spiralling into political chaos, loyal by necessity, discreet by survival, and fortified by the awareness that speaking out of turn might end very, very badly. Now, in Tudor court culture, the people closest to the king's body, tailors, barbers, physicians, valets, often became tools for covering personal scandals, not because they wanted to, but because they were already positioned close enough to dangerous information that drawing them into a secret was more efficient than seeking help elsewhere. And this is where Malte's life intersected with a problem much larger than linen and measurements. By the time Joan Dingley's pregnancy became known to the right, or wrong, people within the palace, Henry's administrators needed a solution. They needed someone with a spotless reputation, someone outside the political factions, someone reliable, someone without powerful family connections, someone who could be quietly rewarded without drawing suspicion. Enter the tailor. It's unlikely Malte was approached with a dramatic confession. This wasn't a theatrical moment of "Malte, my good fellow, we have a royal crisis on our hands." The conversation probably happened behind a half-closed door, with a royal official lowering their voice and Malte realizing, slowly, horrifyingly, that he had no real choice in the matter. He was likely told what he needed to know and nothing more. A child was on the way. Its mother was someone who could not be acknowledged. Its father was someone who absolutely could not be acknowledged. And a story had to be constructed, quickly, neatly, and permanently. The request was extraordinary but also terrifyingly simple. Claim the child. Raise her. Say nothing. Ask nothing. Know nothing. And in return, Malte would receive the kind of royal favour no tailor ever dreamed of. Financial security, land, status, and a permanent place in the shadowy machinery that kept the king's reputation polished. Even before the famous land grants of later years, Malte was already rising. Little benefits began appearing, payments, privileges. Signs that Henry, or those handling Henry's private concerns, considered him more than just a tailor. He became useful, and usefulness, in the Tudor court, was a double-edged sword sharpened by silence. Malte wasn't chosen because Henry loved him like a friend. He wasn't chosen because they shared deep conversations. He was chosen because he was safe, because he was obedient, because the palace needed someone who could be trusted to host a secret without leaking it across half of Europe. Whether Malte understood the full weight of what he was agreeing to is impossible to say. History provides no diary, no private letter, no whispered confession. What it does show us, however, is the aftermath. Malte complying, Malte claiming, Malte becoming the official father of a child whose real paternity required layers of protection. He stepped into the role with the resigned acceptance of a man who knew he'd been drafted into something much larger than himself, something he could not decline without risking not only his position, but possibly his life. And so quietly, with the palace looking on, John Malte became the convenient father that history needed. A tailor who stitched together the most delicate lie of Henry's private life. A man who would soon receive rewards beyond any tailor's station. Rewards that decades later historians would examine and whisper, "This doesn't make sense unless there was far more to the story." A man whose name survives today not because of his trade, but because a king's secret required a man who could vanish into the footnotes of history while carrying the truth on his shoulders. Some births are recorded with fanfare, trumpets, church bells, pages scribbling eagerly in leather-bound registers, and then there are births like Ethelreda Malte's, which slip into history so quietly that if you blink, you'll miss every trace that she ever existed at all. Ethelreda was born sometime between 1527 and 1535, a date range so wide you could comfortably drive a Tudor carriage through it. But that's the point. The records weren't vague by accident. They were vague because someone made sure they were. Illegitimate births at court were always delicate matters, but illegitimate births involving royalty? Those were treated like unexploded political bombs. Silence wasn't just preferred, it was essential. And in Ethelreda's case, silence wasn't merely present, it surrounded her like a moat. But before we wander too far into the political shadows, let's talk about her names. Because Ethelreda Malte collected names the way Tudor nobles collected enemies. Her most formal name, Ethelreda, sounds almost too grand for a tailor's bastard. It's an old Anglo-Saxon saint's name, one associated with piety, nobility and church history. Not something one casually assigns to a laundress's child. Then there's Audrey, the softened English version. It rolls off the tongue more naturally, more gently, a name a child might actually hear spoken around her, a name warm enough for daily use. And then we have Esther or Easter, two variants that appear in different records. These names weren't just spelling errors or lazy clerks. Tudor record keeping may have been chaotic, but not that chaotic. The variations hint at a child who lived in several worlds, each identity carefully assigned depending on the audience. 3 names, 3 versions of herself, 3 reflections of the same secret. Names can be clues, names can be warnings, and in this case, names can be masks. Now consider why the birth date is lost. If a child is meant to be hidden, you hide everything. The mother, the moment of birth, the witnesses. Especially in a palace where information spreads faster than plague. And remember, Joan Dingley was a laundress. She didn't have a powerful family to shield her, or a network of servants to orchestrate cover stories. If anything, her lack of status made her pregnancy even more dangerous. So the palace did what palaces do best. It closed ranks. The washing tubs, the servants' corridors, the quiet storage rooms and drafty corners where women whispered secrets. All of it was swept clean of evidence. A baby was born, and the world pretended not to notice. Her baptism is missing from church records. Her earliest months are swallowed by silence. We don't know who held her, who fed her, or which room she first learned to crawl in. We don't know who whispered lullabies, who soothed her when she cried, or whether Henry himself ever laid eyes on the child he set into motion. What we do know is that the moment she took her first breath, palace officials were already writing her life story for her. She would not be the king's child. She would not be Joan Dingley's secret. She would be John Malt's daughter. Period. No debate, no complications, no space for doubt. But even that story cracks under examination. Because if you hand a newborn to a tailor and declare, "Congratulations, you're a father now," people will talk. So the palace had to move quickly and quietly, with efficiency born from experience. And yes, unfortunately they did have experience. Illegitimate children at court were not as rare as official history would like you to think. Records of Ethelreda's early life read like a void, a polite, carefully curated, politically motivated void. The kind of void that only appears when powerful hands are making sure no one can trace origins or intentions. Her existence was acknowledged just enough to function, never enough to draw attention. And this is where Ethelreda's story becomes more intriguing than most Tudor mysteries. Because while she was born into silence, she was not raised in it. From the moment she arrived, she was placed into a set of circumstances that simply do not fit the life of a tailor's bastard child. But that is for the next chapter. For now, we linger in the quiet moment of her birth, a moment we must reconstruct from what little the palace failed to destroy. Imagine a small chamber or servants' quarters, not the royal birthing room flooded with ladies, midwives, officials, and ceremonial pomp. No velvet cushions, no carved cradle embroidered with royal insignia. Instead, perhaps a midwife who had delivered dozens of babies in the palace's lower ranks. A woman who knew how to keep her mouth shut and head down. Joan Dingley, exhausted, frightened, aware that her child's existence could alter her own fate, or end it. And nearby, perhaps not even present, the machinery of the court already deciding how to make this child disappear into respectability. Whether Joan held her daughter for long, or whether the child was moved swiftly to another location, is lost to time. But we do know that the palace moved with a cold, practiced precision. Royal scandals were handled the way nobles handled swords, carefully, deliberately, and with the understanding that one slip could cost everyone dearly. So a story was chosen for the child, a timeline constructed, a father assigned, and Ethelreda Malte, the child born from a moment the palace could never admit, began her life with 3 names, no recorded birthday, and secrets stitched into every fold of her identity. Her birth is the perfect collision of royal scandal and total anonymity, a child who was simultaneously hidden and protected. Erased and yet provided for, born into silence but destined to leave whispers behind, and from this silence her remarkable and remarkably concealed life would begin to unfold. If you were to observe little Ethelreda Malte in her earliest years, before the world began whispering about her, before historians started tilting their heads at odd documents, you might have been forgiven for thinking she belonged to a noble family, or at least a very wealthy one, the kind with a crest, a lineage, and an endless supply of pride. Certainly not the family of a tailor, no matter how skilled. Because from the beginning, Ethelreda's childhood made absolutely no sense. Let's start with her education. Tailors' daughters in Tudor England typically learned skills that would help them keep a household running: stitching, cooking, cleaning, managing accounts if they were lucky. Reading and writing were luxuries reserved for the elite, and even then mostly for boys. Girls of lower status didn't commonly get ink-stained fingers unless they accidentally brushed up against a spilled inkwell. Yet, Ethelreda, she was taught to read. She was taught to write. She was trained in courtly manners, not just how to curtsy, but how low to curtsy depending on the rank of the person entering the room. She learned dance forms appropriate for noble gatherings. She learned polite conversation, the art of saying something gracious while actually meaning absolutely nothing at all. A vital Tudor skill, useful for both dinners and surviving court politics. None of this matched the life she was supposedly born into. Now, a tailor might scrape together enough coin to give his daughter a modest education. Emphasis on modest. But nothing about Ethelreda's upbringing was modest. It was curated, polished, deliberate. And then there were her clothes. Ah yes, because nothing says I am secretly connected to someone important, quite like a toddler wandering around in fabrics that cost more than the annual wages of most London households. Ethelreda wore velvet. She wore silk. She wore materials dyed in colours so rich that only the affluent, or the dangerously well-connected, could afford them. And velvet in particular was not something parents casually put on children. Velvet was expensive, difficult to clean, and ruinous to replace if a child did something as normal as exist. But Ethelreda had velvet. This raises a simple question. Who was buying it? Because tailors did not purchase velvet. They handled it for their noble clients, yes. They stitched it, shaped it, tailored it to perfection. But purchase it? No. The cost alone could bankrupt a hard-working craftsman in an afternoon. Yet somehow, Ethelreda glided through childhood wrapped in fabrics, befitting a child with far more important blood in her veins than her official paternity suggested. And it wasn't just her clothes or her lessons, it was the company she kept. Ethelreda appeared in noble households, places where she absolutely did not belong if she were truly the illegitimate child of a tailor and a laundress. These were spaces filled with minor aristocrats, courtiers, ladies with pedigrees stretching back to the Norman conquest, gentlemen with estates, and an endless stream of gossipy servants. A tailor's bastard child doesn't stroll into such spaces unless someone wants her there. Someone with influence, someone with reach. Someone who could quietly ensure she was welcomed without anyone asking too many questions. In these noble homes, Ethelreda grew into herself. She learned how to move with grace, how to sit properly, how to listen without staring, how to speak without the rough edges of lower-class speech. She learned to blend in with the daughters of people who mattered. She grew accustomed to polished floors, fine furnishings, and meals served on actual plates instead of wooden trenchers. And of course the servants noticed. Oh, the servants always notice. They saw the way she held herself, a little too confidently for a girl of her supposed station. They watched her handle fine objects with the familiarity of someone raised among them. They saw the way she responded to noble etiquette without hesitation, as though she'd been practicing it since her cradle days. Servants are the true historians of any great household. They are expert observers, and you can imagine the quiet comments exchanged in storage rooms and stairwells. She acts like someone's child. Well, she's not the tailor's, that's certain. Look at the way the lady of the house treats her, like she's important. And that wardrobe? Please, someone wants this girl to look a very particular way. The unspoken thought hung in the air like incense. She must belong to someone. Someone higher, someone hidden, someone with a crown-shaped problem. Her childhood, from all surviving hints, looks far less like the life of a tradesman's daughter and far more like that of a child being groomed quietly for a privileged place, but not a public one, not a recognised one. A place tucked somewhere between openly noble and deliberately obscured. She lived a life that resembled a concealed princess more than the daughter of a tailor and a laundress. And that is where the contradiction sharpens into a point. Because children do not accidentally grow up like Ethelreda Malte did. They do not accidentally receive elite education. They do not accidentally wear velvet. They do not accidentally spend their formative years among nobles. They do not accidentally glide through a world where every detail of their upbringing suggests wealth, status, and deliberate shaping. Ethelreda's childhood was not luck. It was not charity. It was not the generosity of a tailor who suddenly discovered a treasure chest under his shop. It was design, quiet design, careful design. Design so intentional that it leaves fingerprints in places where royal hands were supposed to remain invisible. Her life as a child was the life of someone who mattered. Not publicly, not ceremonially, but intimately, secretly, bureaucratically. A child who was never meant to be recognised, yet never allowed to live like someone forgettable. And that is the strange, dazzling paradox of Ethelreda Malte's early years. A childhood shaped by privilege without explanation, wrapped in wealth without acknowledgement, held in a space between worlds, seen enough to be shaped, hidden enough to be denied. And soon we will uncover the next piece of the puzzle, how the king ensured her future without ever speaking her name aloud. But for now, Ethelreda remains a child suspended between truth and story, a girl impossible to overlook, yet officially invisible. And if you enjoy hearing about the people history tried to shove behind a curtain, hit subscribe. Otherwise the algorithm wins and she gets erased twice. If there is one thing the Tudor monarchy excelled at, besides the occasional beheading, it was the creative use of property. Land wasn't just wealth, it was power, prestige, and political insurance. And in Henry VIII's England, when words became too dangerous, land often spoke in their place. Which brings us to the curious case of John Malte, the tailor who, at least on paper, became the most generously rewarded needle wielder in English history. If tailors everywhere could look back and see what Malte received, they would still be shaking their heads centuries later. Let's begin in 1541, a year when England was still settling into the uneasy aftermath of the dissolution of the monasteries, Henry's grand project of shutting down religious houses and redistributing their wealth. Monastic lands didn't just vanish into the royal estate. They were parcelled out to nobles, loyal servants, and anyone the king felt deserved a reward or needed a bribe. But in 1541, something odd happened. John Malte, a tailor mind you, received lands taken from former abbeys. This wasn't a patch of farmland or a cosy cottage. These were expensive, high-value, prestigious properties, the kind awarded to men who had fought in wars, commanded armies, or personally rescued the king from drowning in a moat. That sort of thing. Tailors? Not so much. Yet Malte received them anyway, and not quietly. These were official grants, recorded and preserved. His name sits in the same list as powerful men, as if the universe simply forgot that he was supposed to be hemming sleeves, not acquiring abbey lands. Still, that was only the beginning, because in 1544, another land grant appeared. This time the paperwork did something astonishing. It named Ethelreda directly alongside Malte. A tailor's supposed bastard daughter now had her name etched into royal property transfers as if she had a formal claim to them. Children like Ethelreda did not get land. They did not get church holdings. They did not get shares in manors. In fact, they usually got nothing at all except maybe a pat on the head and the hope that someone in the household would take pity on them. But Ethelreda received land, not because of John Malte's generosity, and certainly not because royal administrators enjoyed confusing historians. It happened for one reason only. Someone with serious authority wanted her secured. Someone with the power to override tradition. Someone with enough motivation to ensure she had protection, wealth, and a future without ever acknowledging why. And then came 1546, the most revealing year of all. Henry VIII was aging, ill, and overseeing the final distributions of property before his death. Land grants during this time were especially political. They showed who mattered, who would be remembered, and who had done something significant, either publicly or privately, to earn royal favour. In that year, Malte received yet another extraordinarily valuable grant. One historians estimate would be worth hundreds of thousands of pounds in today's money. These weren't scraps being handed out like leftovers. These were prime properties, including manors, churches, and the incredibly powerful right to collect tithes and appoint clergy. To put this into perspective, the right to appoint clergy was something usually reserved for noblemen, great lords and influential families, not tailors whose greatest political achievement was choosing the right fabric for the king's doublet. How did a tailor end up with powers that nudged the edge of religious authority? He didn't. He was given those powers because the king, or the king's administrators acting in silent obedience, needed Malte compensated for something far more significant than thread work. If Malte had simply mended the king's jackets, he might have received a thank you payment, maybe a modest pension if Henry was feeling generous. But large tracts of monastic land, multiple times, including Ethelreda in a royal document. No tailor in English history ever received such wealth, not before, not after. Unless, of course, he was playing a role in a much larger hidden arrangement. At this point in the story, the land grants begin to reveal themselves for what they truly were: financial silencing mechanisms. Property was the Tudor version of hush money, only more elegant, more permanent, and far less likely to raise suspicion among foreign ambassadors. And yet, centuries later, suspicion is exactly what it raises. Historians look at the paper trail and immediately notice the pattern. Tailor receives abbey lands, unusual. Tailor receives additional properties, suspicious. Tailor and child receive joint grants, highly suspicious. Tailor receives final massive grant just before king's death, suspicious enough to make eyebrows lift off foreheads. This isn't how the Tudor system rewarded craftsmen. This is how it rewarded people who performed extraordinary services. Services that could never be publicly documented. And when you strip away the layers of polite explanation, only one truth remains. Malte was being compensated for raising a child who wasn't his. The official narrative, that Ethelreda was simply his bastard daughter, falls apart the moment you examine the math. No tailor's illegitimate child receives thousands of acres. No tailor's illegitimate child appears in land records. No tailor's illegitimate child is tied into a series of grants spaced neatly across years. Years that align suspiciously well with her growth, her needs, and her preparation for adulthood. The grants resemble something very specific: the secret provisioning of a royal bastard. Henry VIII openly acknowledged only one illegitimate child, Henry Fitzroy, his son with Bessie Blount. Fitzroy was granted titles, lands, and public favour. But an illegitimate daughter, especially one born during Henry's politically sensitive years? Absolutely not. A daughter born of scandal, especially scandal involving the king's supposed years of celibacy, had to be handled with far more care. So the palace hid her, and they hid her the Tudor way, by ensuring she had everything she needed without ever revealing why she needed it. Money speaks, land speaks, royal documents speak, even when kings fall silent. And in Ethelreda Malte's case, the land grants do something no proclamation ever would. They tell the truth. They whisper the story the court tried to bury. They trace the outline of a hidden lineage. They reveal a child the king could not name, but ensured would never go without. It is through these grants, these carefully structured, politically motivated gifts, that the shadow of her true identity finally becomes visible. By the mid-1540s, Ethelreda Malte had grown into a young woman whose life made far more sense behind palace walls than on paper. She was educated like a gentlewoman, dressed like a minor noble, and moved through elite households with a kind of practiced ease that simply didn't match the daughter of a tailor, or a laundress, or anyone the official records insisted she was. And now, in the years 1546 and 1547, she approached the age where her future needed to be, let's say, handled. In Tudor England, handling a young woman's future generally meant two things: arranging a marriage and ensuring everyone involved understood exactly what not to talk about. Which brings us to her quietly extraordinary marriage to John Harrington. John Harrington himself wasn't a prince or a great lord, but he came from a family deeply trusted by the crown. His father, also named John because Tudor England never met a naming tradition it didn't immediately reuse, was far more interesting. He served Henry VIII in a role later described as a confidential servant. That phrase wasn't a formal job title. It was royal shorthand for the men assigned to perform tasks too sensitive, too personal, and too unrecorded to be listed as official duties. A confidential servant was someone who accomplished delicate work, handled private matters, and, most importantly, knew when to keep quiet. And that made the Harringtons perfect candidates for the kind of marriage Henry VIII needed to arrange for Ethelreda: discreet, loyal, close enough to the crown to be trusted, yet not so prominent as to draw dangerous attention. So one day, John Malte's supposed bastard daughter, the one who spoke like a noble, dressed like a noble, and seemed inexplicably groomed for noble company, was suddenly engaged to a young man of this discreetly loyal family. And the court noticed. Tailors' daughters do not marry into families like the Harringtons. They marry tradesmen, apprentices, merchants, craftsmen. Not families with political trust measured in royal confidences, but Ethelreda did. And the shock only deepened when word spread about her dowry. Because her dowry was not merely generous, it was stunning, opulent, the kind of dowry noble families angled for, prayed for, schemed for. A dowry far beyond anything a tailor could offer, even a tailor favoured by the king. Her stepson later recorded that Henry VIII personally arranged the match. Not hinted, not suggested, not whispered as gossip. He wrote it plainly: the king arranged this marriage. And no one, not then and not centuries later, has found reason to contradict him. The truth was self-evident. Of course Henry arranged it. Who else had the authority? Who else had the motive? Who else had the wealth? This marriage wasn't a social accident. It was a strategy. A calculated, deliberate placement orchestrated by a king who needed a problem solved quietly. Ethelreda's marriage served several purposes. It ensured loyalty. The Harringtons were reliable people who knew the value of silence. It expected discretion. Taking in a young woman with such an impressive dowry but uncertain origins required tact. And the Harringtons were exactly the sort of family who would never ask the wrong questions. It offered protection. Ethelreda would be safe, financially secure, and socially shielded inside a respected household. And it preserved invisibility. She would live well, but not too visibly. Respected, but not prominent. Present, but never spotlighted. It was the Tudor equivalent of placing a royal secret in a vault guarded by trustworthy people. A vault made of human loyalty rather than stone. And the timing of the marriage matters. If Ethelreda married in 1546 or 1547, she married at the exact moment when Henry VIII was preparing for death. His health was failing, his mobility was nearly gone, and he was busy arranging the last political details of his reign. It was a period defined by wrapping up unfinished business, making amends, providing for those he felt responsible for, and Ethelreda Malte was unfinished business. He could never acknowledge her. Politically, it would have been a catastrophe, but he also could not abandon her. That was not Henry's style. For all his brutality, he was sentimental about his own children, especially the ones who reminded him of his youth, his mistakes, and his passions. So he chose the middle path. She would not be recognised publicly, but she would be placed privately. Her marriage ensured her comfort without exposing her lineage. Her dowry ensured her future without revealing its source. Her new family ensured her safety without ever asking why they were entrusted with her. The Harringtons didn't just gain a bride for their son. They acquired a royal responsibility wrapped in silence, secured with wealth, and stamped with the unmistakable fingerprints of Henry VIII. Ethelreda's life in the Harrington household would be respectable, stable, and entirely shielded from the world that created her. She became a wife, a stepmother, a young woman with connections and comfort, but never the title, never the acknowledgement, never the explanation. She was hidden in plain sight, placed exactly where the king needed her to be, protected by people who understood the value of quiet loyalty. And in that silence she lived the next chapter of her life. A life shaped not by chance, but by the carefully crafted decisions of a king determined to take one final secret with him to the grave. In the spring of 1554, the Tower of London was not just a fortress. It was a place heavy with dread, silence, and the kind of cold that seeps into your bones no matter how many layers you're wearing. And into this grim stone maze walked Lady Elizabeth, daughter of Henry VIII, soon to be queen, but at that moment simply a terrified young woman under arrest. Her crime? Existing inconveniently. Mary the Riost, her half-sister and reigning queen, had just survived Wyatt's rebellion, an uprising protesting Mary's plan to marry Philip of Spain. The rebels invoked Elizabeth's name, claiming she was sympathetic, or worse, involved. Whether Elizabeth was guilty didn't really matter. In Tudor politics, rumour carried as much weight as gospel, so Mary had her marched through Traitor's Gate and locked inside the tower. Elizabeth wasn't allowed many attendants, only 6 women, 6 in a fortress the size of a village, 6 to dress her, watch her, keep her company, and observe her fear. And among those 6 was none other than Ethelreda Malte. This by itself is astonishing. Tailors' daughters do not accompany potential queens into the tower. They do not become the intimate circle of prisoners accused of rebellion. They do not sit beside Tudor royalty in the freezing shadows of political disaster. But Ethelreda did. Her presence wasn't decorative or accidental. It was meaningful, carefully chosen, quietly approved, and almost certainly familiar. Inside the tower, the atmosphere was suffocating. The walls were thick, but not comforting. Every sound, footsteps on stone, keys turning in the heavy locks, distant voices echoed with the reminder that Elizabeth's life was hanging by a thread. And in those moments of fear, it was the women around her who became her lifeline. We have only fragments of what happened inside those walls, but one fragment survives because John Harrington, the son of Ethelreda's husband, later wrote about it. According to him, Ethelreda and Elizabeth shared moments of deep emotion, including a time when they wept together. This detail is small, soft, almost fragile, and yet it reveals an entire world of unspoken truth. 2 young women, both daughters of Henry VIII, one publicly acknowledged, one officially erased, sitting together in a cold tower chamber, grieving, terrified, and bound by a connection neither could speak aloud. Elizabeth was around 20 years old, Ethelreda, likely a few years younger. Not quite girls, not yet powerful women, just two figures in a stone cell, trying to make sense of the cruelty of power. We often imagine royal imprisonment as a grand drama, but the reality is far quieter. Inside the tower, life slowed to a crawl. The women had long stretches of silence, interrupted only by prayers, small talk, and the distant thud of guards passing by. Nothing to distract them from the gnawing fear that Mary's council might sign Elizabeth's death warrant at any moment. And in that atmosphere, emotional barriers crumble quickly. Ethelreda wasn't there to serve as a political prop. She wasn't a maid randomly plucked from the household staff. She was trusted, deeply, the kind of trust that doesn't come from paperwork or protocol, but from familiarity, from shared experiences, shared upbringing, shared understanding. If she and Elizabeth wept together, it was likely not the first time they'd sat together in quiet companionship. It implies a bond stretching years behind them, a childhood spent in overlapping households, shared tutors, glimpsed smiles across corridors, perhaps even the strange, intuitive recognition of something neither could name. Because royalty has a look to it, a manner, a bearing, a presence shaped by privilege and expectation. And Ethelreda had been raised with that exact presence, inexplicably so, unless she too carried royal blood. Imagine them there, Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, and Ethelreda, the daughter of a laundress but protected like a princess, both bound by a father who never placed both names in the same sentence. The tower's chambers were cold, their walls slick with damp. Their windows, narrow slits, meant more for defence than daylight. The women likely sat close to whatever poor excuse for a fire they were given, wrapped in cloaks not nearly warm enough, whispering fears they dared not say aloud. Elizabeth, wondering if she would be executed like her mother. Ethelreda, wondering if she would be next simply because she was there, both knowing how quickly Mary's mood shifted and how deadly her counsel could be. And yet, despite the misery of their surroundings, there is something strangely peaceful about the thought of Ethelreda sitting beside Elizabeth. Two threads of the same lineage woven together in a place designed for despair. Elizabeth survived, of course. The political winds changed just enough that Mary could not justify her sister's execution, and in surviving, Elizabeth stepped back out into history and the history books, the portraits, the speeches, the coronation robes. Ethelreda would not. This moment in the tower is the closest the two daughters of Henry VIII ever come to standing side by side in the historical record. And it is not in a palace or a chapel or a glittering court scene, it is in a prison. Their bond is revealed not through ceremony, but through grief. Not through documents, but through tears. History rarely leaves moments like this intact. Usually the lives of forgotten women are erased entirely, swept away by kings, rewritten by chroniclers, ignored by scholars. But here, in the most unlikely of places, a small truth survived. Ethelreda mattered to Elizabeth, not as a servant, not as a stranger, but as someone who sat beside her in fear and wept with her, and offered the kind of quiet emotional companionship that only comes from shared history. This moment in the tower becomes symbolic, a whisper of the truth Henry VIII tried to hide. One daughter recognized by the world, one daughter erased from it, side by side, in silence, in fear, in sisterhood neither could admit. One of the quiet miracles of history is that no matter how hard powerful people try to bury a secret, some pieces always survive. Not loudly, not boldly, but in small, almost apologetic fragments. A line in a will, an offhand remark in a memoir, a phrase in a property grant, a whisper recorded decades later. Ethelreda Malte's story is not preserved in a single dramatic proclamation. Instead, it's held together by a scattered collection of documents, each one seemingly insignificant on its own. until you line them up and realise they form a mosaic the Tudors never wanted us to see. Let's begin with the one man who knew the official version of the story better than anyone, John Malte. When Malte wrote his will, he did something very important, and very suspicious. He named Ethelreda explicitly as his bastard daughter by Joan Dingley. Now on the surface this seems straightforward. A tailor acknowledges an illegitimate child. Happens all the time in early modern England. But the wording becomes strange the moment you look closer. Malte took special care to name the mother clearly. Joan Dingley. And if that name rings a bell, it's the laundress the palace quietly erased the moment she became inconvenient. Most illegitimate children didn't get their mothers named in legal documents. But this one did. Almost as if someone wanted the story to appear airtight, clean, pre-organised, too organised. Because the moment Malte declares Ethelreda his bastard daughter, the court can close the book. No need for deeper questions. No need to scrutinise who is paying for her education, clothing or noble connections. The story is settled, neatly, officially, suspiciously. But then comes the first crack in the facade. We turn to Sir John Harrington, the witty, sharp-tongued writer who happened to be Ethelreda's stepson, and later one of Elizabeth III's trusted men. He was raised in the same household she entered through marriage. He knew her. He observed her. And long after her death, when writing his own accounts, he casually referred to her as the king's natural daughter. Natural daughter, in Tudor language, was a polite way of saying illegitimate but biologically the child of a monarch. Harrington wasn't exaggerating or gossiping. He was a trusted figure in Elizabeth's circle, and Elizabeth, by all accounts, was fond of him. If he'd written nonsense about someone who grew up beside the Queen, the court would have corrected him, silenced him, or at least raised a fuss. Not a single protest appears, not one letter refuting him, not one angry correction, not even a whisper. In Tudor England, silence was often an admission. Then there are the land grants, those financial breadcrumbs Henry VIII left scattered across 3 decades. In more than one document, Ethelreda is mentioned with the phrase, special love and regard. Let's pause there, because that is not normal tailor's daughter vocabulary. Kings did not grant abbey lands to servants' children because of special love. Kings did not place tailors' daughters directly in legal charters, and kings certainly did not attach language bordering on paternal affection, unless affection had something to do with it. These weren't sentimental flourishes. They were bureaucratic euphemisms, the kind officials used when they knew the truth but weren't allowed to state it. Special love and regard translates roughly to, we all know who this girl truly belongs to, but we're not writing it down. And then, as if the universe wanted to make absolutely certain we didn't miss the point, another voice joins the chorus, decades later, from 1656. A man named Jonathan Leslie, whose family had connections to the Melts, testified that Ethelreda was the king's darling daughter. Now, in 1656, Henry VIII had been dead for a century. There was no political reason to lie, no favour to earn, no danger in speaking openly. Why would Leslie call her a royal daughter unless that was the family's long-standing understanding? Stories whispered through generations don't survive by accident. They survive because they contain a truth too resilient to die. Across these documents and testimonies, one thing becomes clear. Not a single source contradicts the claim that Ethelreda was Henry VIII's child. Not one. Not in any decade. Not from any household. Not from any contemporary. This is remarkable because if the claim were false, scandalous, baseless, or politically offensive, someone would have pushed back. The Tudor court had no shortage of critics, record keepers, or rival factions eager to expose lies. But here, silence. And silence from the Tudor world is louder than shouting. What we're left with is a trail of truths whispered through official documents, private accounts, legal language, and generational memory. all pointing in the same direction. Taken individually, each piece might feel small. Taken together, they form a portrait almost too clear to ignore. Here is what the documents tell us without ever admitting it outright. A laundress disappears from the record after becoming pregnant. A tailor with no political importance receives staggering property grants. A young girl, supposedly as bastard, is raised like royalty. She marries into a trusted family with a dowry beyond her station. She appears in the Tower with Lady Elizabeth. She's mentioned in land grants with affectionate royal phrasing. She's remembered as the king's daughter by those who knew her or her family. It's like a puzzle whose creators wanted it destroyed, yet accidentally left too many pieces lying around. This chapter of Ethelreda's life, preserved not in dramatic events but in legal crumbs, shows how history hides its most inconvenient truths. Henry VIII never publicly acknowledged her, but the archival traces reveal a man who provided for her, protected her, and placed her where she needed to be. Not all kings leave monuments to their secrets. Some leave paperwork. And in that paperwork, the story the Tudors tried to suffocate breathes again. Ethelreda Malte was not merely the child of a tailor. She was the hidden daughter of a king. A daughter never meant to be seen, yet impossible to erase completely. If Ethelreda Malte's story seems unbelievable, if it feels too strange, too quiet, too deliberately hidden to be true, it's only because we tend to imagine Henry VIII as a man whose every affair was publicly announced with trumpets and banners. But the truth is far less theatrical, and far more consistent. Henry VIII had a pattern, a very clear pattern, and it tells us everything we need to know about the daughters he never publicly claimed. Let's begin with Catherine Carey. Catherine was born in 1524, right in the middle of Mary Boleyn's affair with the king. And Mary Boleyn wasn't just any court mistress. She was Anne Boleyn's older sister, meaning the entire situation was awkward enough without adding surprised infants into the mix. Catherine arrived at a remarkably convenient moment for Henry's timeline, and she went on to live a life unusually favoured for a woman of her supposed parentage. Now, officially, Catherine Carey was the daughter of Mary's husband, William Carey, a perfectly respectable explanation, except for the part where Henry showered the Carey family with rewards precisely when Catherine and her brother Henry Carey were born. It's difficult to blame historians for raising an eyebrow there. In fact, you'd need several eyebrows. Still, Henry never acknowledged Catherine as his daughter. Why? Because she was a girl, and in Tudor England, royal daughters born on the wrong side of the sheets were a political nightmare. We'll come back to that. But first, let's look at another candidate, Elizabeth Taleboys. She was born around 1520, shortly after Henry's acknowledged son, Henry Fitzroy. Now, Fitzroy is the exception that proves the rule. Henry claimed the boy eagerly, proudly, even granting him the titles Duke of Richmond and Somerset, and raising him almost like a prince. Why? Because Fitzroy was a boy. Elizabeth Taleboys, on the other hand, received quiet royal attention but never public recognition. Her brother George died young, leaving her as the heiress to the Taleboys' estates. Suddenly, royal generosity flowed her way. She was given lands, she was given support, she was given a place at court, just not a title, not a name, not the truth. Why the difference? Because one thing becomes clear when you trace Henry's behaviour. Illegitimate daughters were a liability. Illegitimate sons were an opportunity. Let's break that down, gently, because Tudor politics can be a bit of a headache, even when taken slowly. Sons, even illegitimate ones, were symbols of the king's virility. They made him look strong, powerful, capable, all excellent characteristics for a 16th century monarch with a very large ego. A son could be flaunted. A son could be raised. A son could be used to show Europe that Henry's bloodline was flourishing. And in Henry Fitzroy's case, a son could even be groomed as a potential heir if things went terribly wrong with the legitimate succession. But daughters were complicated. A royal daughter, even an illegitimate one, held political value. She could be married off. She could be used to form alliances. She could bring foreign influence into England. She could produce children who might someday claim something, anything, that the crown didn't want contested. In other words, daughters were tinderboxes. Dangerous when left unattended, explosive when handled incorrectly, and capable of lighting fires that could burn entire dynasties. Imagine if Catherine Carey had been acknowledged as Henry's child. She might have become a minor diplomatic pawn. She might have been married into a foreign family with ambitions. She might have had sons who later looked at the throne and thought, well, grandfather was a king, wasn't he? Henry wasn't having any of that. Daughters from affairs were not denied out of shame. They were denied out of strategy. Because there were 3 frightening possibilities a daughter could create. She could be married into a foreign dynasty, giving another nation a claim, however flimsy, to England. She could spark internal alliances against the crown, as ambitious nobles formed power blocks around her. She could challenge the legitimacy of heirs by simply existing as evidence that Henry's affections and loyalties wandered. And that last one was particularly dangerous during Henry's lifetime. His marital history was chaotic, to put it politely. Dangerously unhinged, if we're being honest. Acknowledging a daughter born during a politically volatile period, especially during the years when he insisted he was celibate, would have raised questions he absolutely could not afford to answer. And so the pattern emerges. Illegitimate sons were elevated. Illegitimate daughters were erased. Not cruelly, not vindictively, but strategically, quietly, smoothly. They were given support, often generous support. They were given placements. They were given futures, but never the king's name. Catherine Carey. Raised safely, married well. Supported quietly, Elizabeth Tailboys. Provided for, protected, nudged into place. And beyond them, several other whispered candidates. Henry VIII was not unique in this. Medieval and early modern kings routinely acknowledged their sons while pretending their daughters didn't exist. It was political calculus disguised as morality. And crucially, this pattern explains why the existence of an unacknowledged daughter is not unusual. It is the norm. It tells us that if Henry had another daughter, born under secret circumstances, the last thing he would do is publicly claim her. He would protect her, provide for her, place her strategically, ensure her future, and erase her name from anything that could ignite political chaos. Because daughters might marry, daughters might inherit influence. Daughters might produce children whose ambitions exceeded their station, and Henry VIII lived in constant fear of dynastic instability, foreign manipulation, internal rebellion, and any crack in the facade of his authority. So when we examine the historical record and notice daughters who appear to have been shaped, cushioned, or assisted by invisible royal hands, without receiving a single official acknowledgement, the pattern is unmistakable. Henry had illegitimate daughters. He just refused to name them, and the record keepers, the courtiers, the diplomats, the chroniclers of the Tudor world, they understood the unspoken rule: a daughter born in shadow must remain in shadow, which makes the existence of such daughters both expected and invisibly threaded through the political logic of the time. This chapter stands by itself, but it also lays the groundwork for understanding something essential. In a world where illegitimate sons were trumpeted as proof of masculinity, and illegitimate daughters were quietly swept under the rug, it is not surprising at all that one such daughter slipped through the cracks of official history. And if you want those faint little traces to keep being pieced together instead of fading again, go on and subscribe. Most people don't, and that's exactly how stories like this disappear. In January of 1559, London woke with a kind of electric anticipation that only a coronation could summon. Streets were scrubbed, tapestries unfurled, bells rang so enthusiastically that even the pigeons looked annoyed, and into this grand, noisy, carefully orchestrated celebration stepped the new queen, Elizabeth I, poised, brilliant, and finally free from the shadows of her sister Mary's reign. Crowds pressed in to glimpse her. Nobles preened in their finest attire. Foreign ambassadors stared a little too hard, already calculating what this new monarchy meant for their governments back home. It was a spectacle, golden, glittering, humming with joy. And there, woven quietly into the procession, stood someone history barely names, Ethelreda Malte. After a lifetime of being hidden in the margins, Ethelreda appeared among the ladies of honour. She did not lead the procession, she did not carry a sceptre or a train, and she certainly did not receive the breathless attention showered upon the Queen. But she was there, present, visible. For the first and only time in her life she stepped fully, if briefly, into the public eye. Imagine the scene. Ethelreda standing in the shimmering echo of the new Queen's radiance, dressed in the elegant finery expected of a noblewoman. She would have moved with the same poised grace she'd been trained in since childhood, the same grace that always raised questions about who she really was. Velvet rustling, jewels catching the winter light, a face composed with courtly serenity, and only a handful of people in that vast cheering crowd would have understood what her presence meant. Ethelreda was not just another lady in silk, she was the quiet truth standing beside a very loud monarchy, a truth that could never be spoken. Because on that day, as Elizabeth claimed the throne, two daughters of Henry VIII walked the same ceremonial path, one celebrated, one erased. One adorned in public triumph, the other folded neatly into the procession like a secret tucked into a sleeve. It is a haunting image when you picture it clearly. Elizabeth, legitimate daughter of a beheaded queen, rising into power, and Ethelreda, the king's unacknowledged daughter, walking just behind her, knowing she would never have a place in the story that was being written in real time. There is something almost poetic about that moment, something soft, something aching. Because coronations are not just ceremonies, they're declarations. They define who matters, who inherits, who belongs. And for one brief hour, Ethelreda stood in the glow of power she could never claim, sharing the stage with a sister she was never allowed to call sister. The symbolism is sharp enough to cut. But history, ever efficient in its coldness, wastes no time in erasing the inconvenient. Barely weeks after the coronation, the first grand public event of Elizabeth's reign, Ethelreda Malte simply vanished. Her death, recorded with the barest whisper, comes sometime early in 1559. No dramatic illness noted, no public mourning, no poems, no elegies, no carved stone marking her passing. Just the quiet termination of a life the Crown had worked so hard to keep quiet in the first place. In a world obsessed with lineage, her own lineage was granted no future, no noble tomb, no heraldic shield. No inscription hinting at who she truly was. She died quietly, the way she had lived, visible enough to be shaped, hidden enough to be forgotten. And if you're waiting for a moment of outrage from those around her, don't. History gives us nothing. Silence upon silence. The Harrington family continued on, wrapped in the same discreet loyalty that had made them perfect custodians of her secret. As for Ethelreda's own child, her daughter Hester, she makes one brief flicker in the historical record and then disappears just as quickly. No dramatic scandal, no inheritance fight, no fruitful marriage that stitched her descendants into the fabric of future aristocracy. Just a name, an echo, and then nothing. Another branch of Tudor blood, quietly allowed to extinguish itself. And perhaps that was the point. Royal lines are managed, manicured, pruned like topiary. The Tudors in particular had no patience for branches that grew in the wrong direction. Sons could be acknowledged if needed. Sons added strength. Sons could be paraded. But daughters born outside the royal marriage contract, they were risks, not assets. So Ethelreda's line was allowed to fade, trimmed out of the dynasty's future like a blossom cut before blooming. Not through violence, or scandal, or treason, but through silence and neglect, the quietest form of erasure. Which brings us back to that coronation day, the only moment when Ethelreda stepped into the historical spotlight. It is tempting to imagine she felt pride, seeing the sister she'd grown up alongside, however distantly, rise to the highest place in the kingdom. It is equally tempting to imagine the bittersweet ache that must have tugged at her heart, standing close enough to greatness to feel its warmth, yet forever barred from claiming any part of it. Coronations celebrate the chosen. Ethelreda was the unchosen, and still, somehow, she made it into the hall. Her presence becomes a symbol, a reminder that history often elevates one life while quietly burying another, that bloodlines are not erased because they lack meaning, but because their meaning is too dangerous. Ethelreda Malte was a daughter of Henry VIII, but she was also the daughter the crown could never name. The daughter who grew up in velvet but died without a stone. The daughter whose story almost slipped entirely into the dark, saved only by a handful of words, a few land grants, and the faintest footprints in royal corridors. History can be cruelly efficient. It trims, edits, sanitizes, and compresses entire human lives into footnotes, often without a second thought. And in the case of Ethelreda Malte, the official record performs a particularly ruthless bit of narrative surgery. It reduces her to a tailor's bastard. A neat, tidy explanation. Nothing suspicious at all. Just a humble child, born of humble parents, living a life that should have been humble too. Except, of course, it wasn't. Everything about her life, her education, her clothing, her placement in noble households, her marriage, her land grants, her proximity to Elizabeth, points to a deeper truth. A truth inconvenient enough that the crown hid it, papered over it, and hoped the world would politely forget to ask questions. And the fact that Ethelreda's real story had to be pieced together centuries later from scattered clues says more about monarchy than it does about her. Because monarchy is, at its heart, a performance, a curated story, a theatre production in which the script must follow very specific lines, and any ad-libbing, especially from illegitimate daughters, is strongly discouraged. Ethelreda's existence reveals just how flexible records can be when the powerful decide they need to be rewritten. We tend to imagine the royal archives as factual, objective, and carefully maintained, but in reality they were tools, instruments to guide public understanding, shape dynastic legitimacy, protect secrets, and hide anything that might complicate the narrative of the crown. And nothing complicates a royal narrative quite like an illegitimate daughter. Sons, sure, they're manageable. You can acknowledge them, give them a title, parade them about as proof of a king's virility, and everyone applauds. Sons can be polished, educated, knighted, proudly displayed like trophies. But daughters are dangerous. They can be married off, to foreign princes, to ambitious families, to anyone with enough political imagination to consider what that royal blood might do for their lineage. A daughter's womb is a political risk. Her children can become pawns. Her marriage can become leverage. Her very existence can inspire factions to form, quietly at first, then loudly, as history has repeatedly shown. And so, while Henry VIII publicly acknowledged Henry Fitzroy, he quietly buried the stories of daughters who might one day become problematic. This isn't just about secrecy, it's about gendered power. Ethelreda's life is a perfect illustration of how monarchy draws a vicious line between the children it can use and the children it must hide. She shows us how sons are celebrated, legitimized, raised up, even when they're born from scandal, while daughters are brushed aside, permitted to live comfortably but never visibly. A son gets a dukedom, a daughter gets velvet dresses and silence. Ethelreda didn't just grow up in the shadows of palaces, she grew up in the shadows of palaces that she should have inherited, or at least had the right to move through openly. But instead she moved like a ghost, present but unacknowledged, protected but erased, provided for but never claimed. The tragedy of her life is not a dramatic one. She wasn't executed, she wasn't exiled, she didn't die in some dramatic scandal. Her tragedy is quieter, softer, almost unbearably subtle. She was raised for a world she could never openly belong to. Everything about her upbringing suggests someone intended her to be formed, educated, polished, and prepared, not for public grandeur, but for private safety within noble society. She learned to behave like a woman of rank, but she would never officially be allowed to be one. Imagine spending your entire life moving like a noblewoman, speaking like a noblewoman, dressing like a noblewoman, yet always knowing that to the official record you were nobody, a whisper, a name that appeared only when absolutely necessary, and then only in the most carefully controlled contexts. Ethelreda may have been closer in blood to the crown than many who later wore it, yet she had less right to that connection than any court official who bowed to her half-sister. That is the bitterness at the heart of her story. She lived on the periphery of power, close enough to taste it, never permitted to touch it. And then, as if fate wanted to underline this irony, she died just weeks after Elizabeth's coronation. She lived long enough to see Elizabeth crowned, to watch the triumph of a sister she could never call sister. She stood in the procession, close but invisible, and then slipped quietly out of history before she could ever claim a future under the new queen. Her daughter Hester flickered briefly in the record and disappeared soon after, another branch of Tudor blood clipped before it could grow. Whether by accident or design, the line simply dissolved, and Ethelreda became what the Tudors needed her to be, a footnote, a whisper, a shadow. But shadows have a way of surviving. They stretch, they linger, they tell stories even without faces or voices, and Ethelreda's shadow is shared by countless women in history. Women erased not because they lacked significance, but because their existence threatened someone else's narrative. Women whose stories would have complicated men's ambitions, so those stories were trimmed, rewritten, softened, or buried. Ethelreda stands with them, quietly, elegantly, silently. The legacy she was never allowed to have is not a lineage, or a tomb, or a heraldic crest. It is a reminder of the women history tried to fold away like unwanted letters, and of the quiet truths that survive despite centuries of strategic forgetting. Her life shows us that erasure is never complete, silence is never perfect, and the truth has a way of surviving in fragments, land grants, wills, stray memoirs, whispers scattered across time, waiting for someone someday to piece them together. And now, here you are, listening. A quiet act of remembrance for a woman who lived in velvet and died in silence. A woman who mattered far more than anyone ever dared write down. As we drift back into the present, leaving the candlelit corridors of the Tudor world behind, it's hard not to feel just how many hidden stories still lie beneath the surface of history. Entire lives tucked between lines, folded beneath official narratives, swept neatly out of sight so the powerful could maintain the version of truth that suited them best. And yet, even in the quiet, even centuries later, those stories still press upward like flowers beneath stone. You've just spent hours with one of them, A woman who officially mattered to no one but whose life silently brushed against kings, queens, rebellions, and coronations. Ethelreda Malte wasn't a legend. She wasn't a rumour. She wasn't a symbolic, moral lesson crafted by some later writer. She was real. She lived. She mattered. And she deserved better than erasure. As you lie there, maybe blinking sleepily, maybe already half dreaming, think about how effortlessly a life can be rewritten when power decides it must be. Think about how many truths are missing from the pages we're taught, and how many voices are absent simply because they were inconvenient. Ethelreda's life is one of those quiet truths. A woman shaped by palaces she could never claim, written out of records she should have filled, remembered only in fragments because the world around her found her existence too complicated to acknowledge. But right now, you remembered her. You gave her minutes, maybe hours, of attention. Something the official record never allowed her. There's something quietly beautiful in that. If you're still awake, thank you for staying with this forgotten story. And if you're drifting off, that's all right. Let history keep you company as you fade into sleep. It has a long memory, and it rarely minds repeating itself softly. And before you go, if you'd like more stories the world tried to hide, more lives that slipped through the cracks of the official version, more truths whispered between the lines, subscribe. Most people don't, and that's exactly how stories like hers disappear all over again. You supporting this channel isn't just helping me, it's helping keep the forgotten alive.